To understand the nightmare of the tunnel rats, you first have to understand the frustration of the American war machine. By 1966, the United States had brought the most advanced technology in history to Vietnam. We had B-52 bombers that could turn a mountain into dust. We had napalm that could burn the oxygen out of the air. We had helicopters that gave us godlike mobility. But 20 miles northwest of Saigon, in a place called the Iron Triangle, none of that mattered. The district of Cu Chi was a paradox. By day, American infantry would patrol the rice paddies and rubber plantations. They would walk over the ground, securing the area, confident that they owned the terrain. But when night fell, the ground beneath their feet would come alive. Snipers would appear out of nowhere, fire a single shot, and vanish. Mortar rounds would rain down on U.S. bases from empty fields. Patrols would trigger ambushes, and, when they returned fire, they would find nothing but empty jungle and rustling leaves. It was a ghost war. The enemy wasn't just hiding in the jungle, they were inside the earth. The Viet Cong had built a secret city, not a bunker, but a web. 200 miles of tunnels dug by hand, basket by basket, stretching from the Cambodian border all the way to the gates of Saigon. We were fighting on a two-dimensional map, while the enemy was fighting in 3 dimensions. For the American GI, this psychological toll was heavy. You could feel them. You knew they were there, right under your boots. Watching, waiting, and eventually, we realized that we couldn't bomb them out. We couldn't burn them out. Someone had to go down there. They didn't start as a formal unit. There was no tunnel rat school at Fort Benning. It started out of necessity. When a patrol found a hidden trapdoor, usually a small square of wood covered in leaves and dirt, no bigger than a pizza box, the standard procedure was to throw a grenade in and seal it. But intelligence needed to know what was down there. We needed maps. We needed documents. We needed to know how big the network really was. So, the call went out. We need a volunteer. Who volunteers to crawl into a black hole, knowing it might be booby-trapped, knowing a cobra might be waiting, or a man with an AK-47? They were a special breed. Usually small men. You had to be small. The tunnel entrances were tiny, designed for the slender frame of the Vietnamese soldier. If you were a big corn-fed American boy, 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, you would get stuck. So they looked for the wiry guys, the short guys, 5'5", 5'6". Most of them were engineering specialists, but many were just grunts who had something to prove, or perhaps a death wish. They called themselves tunnel runners at first. Later, the press gave them the name that stuck, tunnel rats. Their motto was non gratum anus rodentum, a bastardized Latin phrase meaning, not worth a rat's ass. It was dark humor, but down there, humor was the only defense mechanism you had. The preparation for a tunnel run was a ritual of stripping away the modern world. First, you took off your flak jacket, it was too bulky. Then, you took off your helmet. It would clang against the clay ceiling and give away your position. You left your M16 rifle at the surface. The barrel was too long to turn in the narrow corners, and the muzzle flash in a confined space would blind and deafen you instantly. So, what were you left with? A flashlight. Usually an L-shaped military torch with a red lens filter to save your night vision, though many rats preferred the yellow light to see tripwires better. A knife, for probing the dirt for mines, or for the grim reality of hand-to-hand combat in the dark, and a gun. The weapon of choice was the M1911 .45 caliber pistol, heavy, reliable, a man-stopper. But firing a .45 in a tunnel was like setting off a cannon inside a phone booth. The concussion alone could bleed your ears. Some guys carried a revolver sent from home, a .38 special tunnel rat kit with a suppressor. But mostly you were armed with your senses. Before you went down, you stood at the edge of the hole. The sun was hot on your back. The sky was blue. You took a deep breath of fresh air, filling your lungs, knowing it might be the last clean breath you ever took. You looked at your buddies on the surface. They would pat you on the shoulder. Good luck. See you on the other side. But their eyes said something else. Their eyes said, better you than me. Script. Lowering yourself into the hole was the crossover point. Feet first or head first? If you went feet first, you could feel for the floor, but if someone was waiting below, They would shoot your legs or drive a Punji stake through your boot. If you went head first, you had your gun ready, but the blood rushed to your brain and you were vulnerable to a machete swing to the neck. Most chose feet first. You slid down. The square of sunlight above you became smaller and smaller. The temperature dropped. The air changed. It became thick, stale, smelling of damp earth, human waste, and old food. Then, darkness. Total, absolute darkness. You turn on your flashlight. The beam cuts through the gloom, illuminating the walls. Hard-packed clay. Claw marks from the tools used to dig it. The silence hits you instantly. The sounds of the jungle, the birds, the wind, the artillery are gone. All you can hear is your own heart beating. Thump. 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 You are now in their world. The tunnel is tight. Your shoulders brush the sides. You have to crawl on your hands and knees. Sometimes you have to crawl on your stomach. You pause. You listen. Is that a scratching sound ahead? Is it a rat? A scorpion? Or is it the safety catch of a rifle being clicked off? You tighten your grip on the pistol. You inch forward. The hunt has begun. Once you were inside, the shock of the darkness eventually faded, replaced by a terrifying realization. This wasn't just a tunnel. It was a city. The Kuchi network was a marvel of engineering, born out of desperation and genius. It wasn't just a straight line. It was a multi-level complex, digging 3 stories deep into the earth. Level 1 was for shooting, firing ports hidden in termite mounds, trenches that connected to spider holes. Level 2 was for living, sleeping quarters, kitchens, meeting rooms. Level 3, the deepest level, was for survival. Air raid shelters, wells for fresh water, and routes to the Saigon River. As I crawled deeper, my knees scraping against the hard clay, I encountered the blast doors. These were heavy wooden trapdoors, reinforced with rubber and dirt. They weren't just for privacy. They were designed to stop the overpressure of a grenade blast or the flow of tear gas. If we threw a gas grenade into the entrance, the Viet Cong would simply close the door, seal it with clay, and wait for the gas to dissipate. Sometimes the tunnel would dip sharply downward into water. A U-turn submerged in murky, stagnant water. To keep going, you had to take a deep breath, dive into the black water, swim under the clay wall, and pop up on the other side. We called them water traps. They blocked gas. They blocked dogs. And for a tunnel rat, they were a test of pure nerve. You never knew if you would come up for air on the other side, or if a pair of hands would be waiting to hold you under. About 200 meters in, the tunnel widened. I could actually stand up, hunched over, but standing. The air here smelled different. Not just earth, it smelled of rubbing alcohol, old blood, and sickness. I swept my flashlight around. Shadows danced on the walls. I had stumbled into a field hospital. It was empty now, evacuated minutes before we arrived. But the signs of life were everywhere. There was a table made of bamboo crates. On it, a discarded bandage soaked in red. Glass vials of medicine, some stolen from U.S. supplies, some French, some homemade, lined a shelf dug into the dirt wall. I saw surgical instruments made from scrap metal. Specifically, I saw a scalpel made from the jagged metal of a downed U.S. aircraft. The irony hit me hard. They were using our own bombs to save their lives. Imagine performing surgery down here. No electricity. Only the light of a candle or a bicycle generator. The heat would be unbearable. The risk of infection 100%. Yet they did it. Amputations, bullet removals, childbirth. It felt like walking through a tomb that was still warm. I touched a kettle on a small stove. It was still hot. They were here, just minutes ago. Further down, I found the kitchen. You might wonder, how do thousands of people cook underground without suffocating, or without the smoke giving away their position to American spotter planes? The answer was the Huang Cam stove. It was brilliant. The stove was dug deep into the floor. The smoke from the cooking fires was channeled through a series of long underground pipes. These pipes acted like filters, cooling the smoke down. By the time the exhaust reached the surface, hundreds of yards away, it was just a faint wisp of heat that dispersed instantly in the jungle mist. We bombed the jungle because we saw smoke, but the smoke was never where the people were. I looked at the blackened pots. rice, tapioca root. Sometimes, if they were lucky, a rat or a snake. This was their fuel. While we ate steak and drank cold beer back at base camp, they fought on a handful of cold rice and sheer willpower. Standing there in the dark, gripping my .45, I realized we weren't fighting a primitive enemy. We were fighting an enemy that had become one with the earth. But the greatest enemy down there wasn't the Viet Cong. It was the air itself. Ventilation was provided by bamboo tubes driven up to the surface, disguised as tree roots or termite hills. But it was never enough. The oxygen levels in the tunnels were constantly low. You felt it in your lungs, a heaviness, a tightness in your chest. After 20 minutes, you'd get a headache. After an hour, you'd start to get dizzy. The tunnel sickness. Carbon dioxide would build up. Rotting vegetation produced methane. Sometimes we would find NVA soldiers dead, not from a bullet, but simply because they fell asleep in a dead-end tunnel and the air ran out. Breathing down there felt like breathing through a wet towel. I checked my watch. I'd been down for 40 minutes. The walls seemed to be closing in. My heart was hammering faster, not from fear, but from the lack of oxygen. I needed to turn back. But then, my flashlight beam caught something on the floor. A wire, a tripwire, thin as a spider's web, stretched across the path at ankle height. I froze. If I had taken one more step, I traced the wire with my eyes. It led up the wall to a bundle of sticks tied to the ceiling. A scorpion trap? Or a grenade? I couldn't go forward. I couldn't go back quickly. I was alone. 3 stories underground, running out of air, and staring at death. I froze. My eyes traced that thin wire across the tunnel floor. It was fishing line, translucent, almost invisible. If I had been moving a fraction of a second faster, if my flashlight beam hadn't caught that tiny glint of reflection, I would be dead. Or worse. In the tunnels of Cu Chi, the Viet Cong didn't just want to kill you, they wanted to maim you. They wanted to take you out of the fight and force 2 other men to drag you out, effectively removing 3 soldiers from the battlefield with a single trap. I carefully stepped over the wire, but the terror didn't stop, because down here, the ground itself was a weapon. The most common nightmare was the Punji stake. Imagine a pit dug into the floor, covered with a fragile layer of twigs and leaves, camouflaged perfectly with the clay. You step on it, and your leg plunges down. At the bottom are sharpened bamboo stakes, fire-hardened to be stronger than steel. They penetrate the sole of your boot and drive straight into your foot and calf. But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. The Viet Cong knew that a clean wound would heal. So, they covered the tips of the stakes in human waste, rotting meat, or toxic plants. The infection was instantaneous. In the humid bacterial oven of the tunnels, gangrene would set in within hours. A step into a Punji pit didn't just mean a hole in your foot. It often meant losing your leg. Some of these pits were designed with barbs pointing downward, like a fishhook. You could step in, but you couldn't pull your leg out without ripping the flesh apart. You were trapped, anchored to the ground in the dark, screaming for help, knowing that your screams were just alerting the enemy to your location. But the ingenuity of the traps went beyond bamboo. They used nature against us. We called them living traps. I remember crawling into a small chamber and hearing a hiss. Not a mechanical click, but a hiss. The Viet Cong would take a bamboo viper, a small bright green snake with venom that could rot your blood, and tie it to a piece of bamboo on the ceiling. They used a piece of string to tie its tail, leaving it dangling in the dark. When a tunnel rat crawled by, his face would brush against the snake. The snake, terrified and angry, would strike. We called it the 3-step snake, because the joke was that after it bit you, you'd only take 3 steps before you dropped dead. In reality, it took about 30 minutes of agonizing pain as your nervous system shut down. Imagine being bit in the face, in the pitch black, miles from a medic. You could feel the poison working through your veins, your throat closing up, and there was nothing you could do but wait for the end. And then there were the scorpions. Sometimes they would fill a box with scorpions and balance it on a door ledge. You nudge the door open, the box tips, and suddenly you are covered in stinging arachnids. Panic sets in. You thrash around. And in your panic, you trigger the real trap. A grenade with the pin pulled, waiting under the dirt. Everything was a trigger. A flag on the wall? Don't touch it. A pack of cigarettes left on the floor? Don't pick it up. A loose brick? Don't step on it. It was psychological torture. You became afraid to move. You became afraid to touch anything. Every inch of the tunnel was a potential grave. I remember looking at a C-ration can sitting on a ledge. It looked like trash. But I noticed a tiny wire running from the back of the can into the wall. A toe popper mine, designed to blow your foot off. The level of craft they put into killing us was terrifyingly impressive. They used unexploded American ordnance, dud bombs and shells, sawed them open, and repurposed the gunpowder to make their own mines. We were literally being killed by our own weapons, returned to us with interest. I wiped the sweat from my eyes. The air was getting thinner. The smell of fear, my own fear, was pungent. I had bypassed the wire. I had checked for snakes. But the tunnel continued into the blackness, and I knew, deep down, that the next trap was waiting. And this one might not be so easy to spot. The deeper you went, the inevitable became reality. You were not alone. At some point, the silence would break. It usually started with a sound, a cough, the click of a bolt, or sometimes just the sound of breathing that wasn't your own. Encounters in the tunnels were short, violent, and deafening. Imagine being face to face with an enemy in a tube the size of a sewer pipe. You can't dodge. You can't take cover. There is only the man in front of you. I remember turning a sharp corner and shining my light directly into the face of a Viet Cong soldier. He was just as terrified as I was. I squeezed the trigger of my .45. Bang. The sound wasn't just a noise, it was a physical blow. In the confined space, the concussion hit me like a sledgehammer. My ears instantly went dead. The muzzle flash blinded me. I was firing blind, emptying the magazine into the darkness, screaming to relieve the pressure in my ears. When the shooting stopped, the silence was worse than before. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. I couldn't hear if he was dead. I couldn't hear if more were coming. I just lay there in the dark, smelling the cordite and the blood, waiting for my vision to return. Sometimes, we couldn't shoot. If the tunnel was unstable, a gunshot could cause a cave-in, burying us both alive. So, we used knives. Fighting for your life with a bayonet in pitch-black darkness is something that takes a piece of your soul that you never get back. It is primal. It is intimate. You can feel the other man's fear. You can feel his life leaving him. We came up from those holes covered in red clay and red blood, looking like demons. We were winning the fights, but we were losing our minds. Eventually, the generals realized that sending men down one by one was a suicide mission. They decided to destroy the earth itself. Operation Cedar Falls. The Iron Triangle had to be erased. First, they sent in the dogs. Tunnel dogs. German shepherds trained to sniff out the enemy. But it was a disaster. The dogs would locate a trap door, but once inside, the lack of oxygen and the overwhelming smell of bats and humans confused their senses. Many dogs were killed by traps or simply refused to go further. So, we turned to chemistry. We brought in massive blowers, huge fans usually used to dry crops. We pumped tear gas into the tunnels for hours. We pumped acetylene gas into the shafts and ignited it, trying to blow the tunnels apart from the inside. The ground would shake. Smoke would billow out of the jungle floor from 100 hidden vents, revealing the massive scale of the network. It looked like the earth was bleeding smoke, but even that wasn't enough. The tunnels were too deep, too strong. So, they called in the arc light, the B-52 Stratofortress. 3 bombers, flying at 30,000 feet invisible from the ground, each plane carrying 30 tons of high explosives. When an arc light strike hits, it feels like an earthquake. The ground turns to liquid. The shock waves travel deep into the earth, collapsing tunnels, shattering eardrums, and turning the complex maze into a mass grave. We walked through the aftermath. The jungle was gone. It was just a moonscape of craters and splintered trees. We thought we had destroyed them. We thought the tunnels were dead. But we were wrong. At night, from the bottom of the craters, they would crawl out again, digging, rebuilding, moving supplies. The tunnel rats of Kuchai taught us a hard lesson. You can destroy the land, but you cannot destroy the will of an enemy who is willing to become the land itself. I survived my tour. I made it back to the world of sunshine and open spaces. But even now, 40 years later, I cannot sleep in a room with the door closed. I cannot go into a basement. Sometimes, at night, I wake up unable to breathe, feeling the weight of the earth pressing down on my chest, and I can still smell the clay, the cordite, and the fear. For us, the war ended. But for the tunnel rats, part of us never left the hole. Thank you for watching this episode of Beneath the Metal. The underground war in Vietnam was a unique hell that tested the limits of human endurance on both sides. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it to keep the history alive.